Hello, and welcome to the 5-year finance webinar. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Bart Rademaker, who, among other things, is very impressively a Nobel Prize nominee and expert in regenerative medicine and stem cells. Briefly, as most of the audience will know, I run Novum Insights, which brings you this 5-year finance webinar series, looking at where the world will come 5 years from now. And we're really excited at Novum by healthcare. So the sort of, this is a keynote speech I gave a few years ago, just to give us a teaser of some of the research that we're doing and looking at healthcare from a blockchain perspective. And I think it sets up some of the topics that we're going to talk about today. I mean, healthcare, as everyone now on this call will realize, is just such a big part of our economy. And as we've realized over the last few months, is also the sector that if we don't get it right, huge consequences can happen, like the recent COVID-19 pandemic bringing the world to a halt. So obviously, healthcare itself is a $6.5 trillion industry. The pharmaceutical revenues are more than $1 trillion. Revenues from drug sales and nearly $10 billion, and the global healthcare fraud is $455 billion per year, and the medical records market itself is $11 billion market, and the size of investment. So just the first genome that got sequenced in another Nobel Prize winning project cost $1 billion. So it's an astonishingly large sector. And this just for the sake, I was asked to talk about blockchain, which I think is very much in the news at the moment, just because people are talking about blockchain using identity solutions to look at the COVID-19 pandemic, and our analysts at Novum are finding that we've come across a lot of researchers that have come at this epic. But things like healthcare fraud is a massive issue. It's early days in blockchain adoption, but there's a huge mention of this in earning calls across the board in corporates. And in the healthcare industry, slightly less so, but skipping through in terms of this data, but we're happy to talk with people about a lot of it. There's a general, like the names are all sort of major global corporations forming the likes of GlaxoSmithKline, Novartis, Merck. All of these groups are sort of pouring money into healthcare, as is IBM into blockchain and healthcare, but also just generally the best levels of research. But this is just really a teaser for what we are looking at in Novum, and we're actually hugely excited to be sort of looking at the importance of we're working with one of our partners looking at intellectual property and patents linked to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we thought it'd be great to bring a leading practitioner from Florida, Bart Rademaker, who to discuss the topic of stem cells. So welcome, Bart.
Thank you so much, Louis. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Yeah, and so Bart, you've been running sort of workshops at the moment looking at sort of how stem cells can be used in the treatment of COVID or in the response to COVID. Sort of what's going on there?
So It's really quite fascinating, Toby, for so many different levels, because regenerative medicine really represents a paradigm shift in how is it that we can reduce the burden of disease and improve quality of life. And so, in particular, in this case with COVID-19, the opportunity to save people's lives using, regenerative medicine or cell therapy is phenomenal. And then, of course, bringing that to the forefront to the public's, awareness that yes, this is a new type of medicine that's becoming available for everyone.
Fantastic. So in terms of sort of what you see happening and what most excites you in the field, what are the sort of major changes that you're
Right.
thinking? Where are the advances? How are you improving people's lives?
Well, it's an awesome time to be in medicine today. And as I discussed with you previously, we're undergoing three revolutions, but I'm going to stick with the one right now. The one right now is the regenerative revolution, because it really represents part of the paradigm shift in what we need to focus on. Doctors have traditionally really focused on treating the symptom, after everything sort of happens. And based on our new insights, which actually are not quite new. I mean, if you go back to the Greek philosophers, Hippocrates and Aristotle, they actually already knew about regenerative medicine, but it's not until now, more than 2,000 years later, that we're able to embrace, we're able to engage with it, and then do what we really need to do, and that is focus on the source of the problem. So it's really looking at what's causing the problems of disease in the first place and attacking it there versus just treating the symptoms. And one way that I like to look at it, which your listeners will appreciate, is that my perspective or my vision of the future doctor is one that won't be prescribing drugs and won't be performing surgeries. So I'm not sure how those pharmaceutical companies will like that, but that truly is the future.
And so true, right? Like the sort of, if you can avoid a drug or a um, prevention is better than cure, right?
Right.
Um,
Absolutely.
um, so, I mean, where do you see? I mean, I guess it's interesting in some ways. I think governments around the world, perhaps in Asia, um, now it's felt have perhaps performed better than even in Europe and the US, right, in their response to this COVID crisis. But what lessons do we learn? I think part of it, there's going to be major investment in healthcare, but what do you see happening to your sector?
So you mentioned something earlier on in your introduction about fraud, and with any kind of new opportunity, a lot of people will abuse it and take advantage of it, particularly because the way stem cells is represented, and I typically don't use that word, by the way, I use the term regenerative medicine, which is more appropriate. But just for the moment, people are seeing stem cells as the miracle cure. I think penicillin was that once, and aspirin was that once as well, and we're still finding out that maybe the apple is the cure. And that's actually what's true, because regenerative medicine taps into the potential of the body to restore form and function. It's the most natural process by which we can actually restore form and function. So the challenge that we have is that a lot of bad actors are out there. They're opportunists. They're taking advantage of the desperate people and charging them exorbitant amounts of fees and basically misrepresenting what's going on. So the future is going to be challenged a little bit with regulation, which is appropriate on many different levels. Sometimes unfortunate, because as a physician, we're committed to save people's lives. And if the science is already available out there, we can't get access to it. That's a problem. So what I see that's going to be happening over the next 5, 10 years is that, particularly now with this COVID happening and the awareness of how regenerative medicine has saved lives, is that that will be sped up, and hopefully with a much better oversight, people will get access to this. And that's part of what my intention is, putting together a training program for physicians to be able to implement regenerative medicine in a very ethical way, but also with great confidence.
Fantastic. So, and just in terms of, I mean, what's the, so in terms of a concrete example of where regenerative medicine has been well implemented, what's your sort of favorite sort of cases that you've dealt with?
Okay, so I just want to qualify one thing,
Yeah.
right? Here in the United States, the FDA is very clear on us doctors not wishing to advertise regenerative medicine or make specific testimonials, and I'm like to honor that. However, been in the space for the last 10 years, we see that potential very powerfully in how regenerative cells actually work. And if you look at any kind of medical condition, there's inflammation, there's an immune response, there's microorganisms, there's ischemia, which is low oxygen or low blood supply. So the potential of cells is to be able to restore all of that. So you take a couple of cases like Parkinson's, or you take like traumatic brain injury, concussion. You know, that's a big issue here in the United States with football. Um, Possibly in rugby too. I used to play rugby, but I never got that concussion. So the idea then is that a lot of inflammation is occurring in that situation. So by providing the regenerative or the cell therapy, there's that potential to reduce that inflammation and therefore, you know, reverse or eliminate the actual problem. Because take concussion as an example, that's almost a like a closed loop. I mean, you get inflamed and it gets worse and it gets worse. It's a vicious cycle. And so you break that cycle and patients can recover. Same thing with Parkinson's. You reduce that inflammation and then you potentially reverse the entire symptoms. And I've actually seen that happen.
That's fantastic, right? So and reversing the symptoms of Parkinson's must be just phenomenal to see happen, right, in someone's life.
Well, when you think about it, if I may say so, Toby, you know, I've seen these extremely successful, you know, intelligent people, and then in their 70s, you see the despair and the frustration in their faces when they can't even button their own shirt. They can't even, you know, cut their egg on toast for breakfast. Being able to give that quality of life back to them, that's very normal, is amazing. It's mind blowing.
What's the intervention that's happening to the tissues? Like where are you working? Is it in which parts of the body? In terms of...
So technically, all parts of the body. I mean, really. So this is how it really works. Very briefly, okay. So we have 70 trillion cells in the body, and a very small number of cells are what's called stem cells. And those stem cells are dedicated specifically to replace certain kinds of cells. Just take your skin, for example, or take your intestines. You know, there's a huge loss and turnover of cells going on all the time. So you need immature cells to make mature cells or differentiated cells. And so technically, you're going to have stem cells all over the body. And so the concept then is if we can stimulate those cells to do what it is that they need to do when there's an imbalance in the body, then that's, you know, how that healing process works. Because essentially, the problem with all kinds of medical conditions, it's either loss of tissue, you know, it's an infection, it's an inflammation, as I mentioned earlier, it's an immune response. And take COVID, for example. So the COVID, what's happening with that is that with the inhalation of the virus, then there's a spike on the virus itself that hooks up to a receptor that's very predominant in the lungs, which is the ACE2 receptor. Once that virus gets into it, there's an emulsion that is occurring around the virus, and then it bursts and breaks up the cell. And in that breakup, there's what's called a cytokine storm. So cytokines create massive inflammation throughout the lungs and creates all sorts of other problems, including blood clotting. And then with the regenerative cells, the idea is that it blocks that process. So either the cytokine storm doesn't happen, or when it does happen, it really reduces it significantly so that the patient can recover and get rid of the cells.
Fascinating. That's amazing. So in terms of, so the intervention, you'll begin to sort of effectively help the sort of the virus's interaction with the lung effectively. You sort of, and how does that work exactly? So you're sort of performing a form of surgery on the lung, or what happens there?
Oh, the actual intervention,
Yeah,
basically,
yeah,
and that was your original question.
yeah, yeah,
So it's intravenous. So
yeah,
it's for example, in many cases, say like if we're taking care of neurodegenerative diseases or the cytokine storm from COVID, that would be in an intravenous infusion. Studies are currently looking at, anywhere in the number of 50 million cells per infusion with significant success. And there's clinical studies out there, so anybody can make references to those. So I'm not quoting anything that hasn't been, peer reviewed already. But there's also for other conditions like arthritis, as an example, that would be joint injections. So currently many people undergo all sorts of joint injections with either steroids, which is a common one, PRP, which is another one. So the physicians are also introducing regenerative cells for that as well. And in essence, if you look at it from the perspective of when you use a drug has only a single entry point. It sort of attacks one receptor and then with all sorts of consequential side effects, if you will. And it's almost like if you have an injury and you find a doctor walking on the street, he can help you with one thing. When you go to the hospital, you've got all the resources. And that's sort of what cell therapy is. Cell therapy is able to respond to all the situations that are happening in the body and to recreate what I like to call the balance. So giving it intravenously, it spreads throughout the body. And if there's any kind of imbalances, then that should help that. I mean, we've seen it, for example, in diabetics, where the diabetic markers actually are reduced.
Fantastic. I mean, it is incredible, like the advances you see in medicine. I mean, what generally, in terms of medical technology, of course, you're a preeminent expert in regenerative medicine, but at the same time, which of the major advances coming in healthcare are you most excited about, including stem cells? But I'm just interested in other areas where you think it's sort of interacting.
It's a really interesting question, and it really is. We can look at it on two levels. The one level is if you look, beyond 50 years ago, patients were really participating in their own health. They weren't just relying on the doctors and drugs, to cure them or heal them, mainly because a lot of people didn't have access to doctors, and so they had to figure it out themselves. So I think we're getting back to that place where people are assuming that responsibility for themselves. So that's the biggest shift, already. Also because of all the access to information that's amazing. The other part I think is relevant is the wellness revolution that basically started, picking up speed in the late 1980s, 1990s, where people getting our access to all sorts of things that they can do themselves to not just prevent disease, but to obtain a much higher level of health and wellness. And as a coach myself, I recognize that there's a 10x, 20x in all of us. We can be 10 times more than we are right now. So that really starts off with health, or let's say wellness. And so it's looking at supplements, it's looking at lifestyle, it's looking at things like meditation. We all now know that we have to sleep, we have to move, we have to eat right. and we have to get that inner balance. So that's the wellness revolution. So that's well underway, and that's also a $1 trillion industry right now. Then, since '09 in the United States, when the first clinical trials for stem cells was allowed by the FDA, now we're really picking up speed and accelerating, especially with the COVID now. And that is a major area besides what I just mentioned, but just take, for example, the ability to do gene mapping, but also understanding how disease processes work and how to target different drug therapies based on the lab studies of stem cells, which is phenomenal. So we don't have to practice on humans anymore. We can practice on cells and see how drugs can actually target different problems. But where it gets really exciting, Toby, is that if you have a diabetic, for example, and if you were able to harvest some of their pancreatic cells that make the insulin, and you can proliferate a large number of those cells and give it back to that patient no longer has to use insulin. And that's well underway right now. And I'm guessing in about 5 years, you'll start seeing patients not needing insulin anymore because they can now create it themselves. I mean, it's phenomenal. But then there's another part, and there's no official name for this yet, but it's all about energy, and it's all about the input and output devices. And I'm not just talking about high tech. I'm really talking about how is it that we tap into the energy of the body, the vibrations of the body, to also restore form and function. And so that's the biotech, revolution that is still in the gestation period, I think, because a lot of people are focusing on the devices that can measure stuff and everything else. But that's just a tip of the iceberg. What's really going to happen is understanding energy in the body and our systems and how it can change that.
It's fantastic, right? And I think it is amazing. I guess I think a lot of both our country and the US in some ways have been pretty poor in some way, that people looking after themselves with obesity and smoking and alcohol and drugs and whatever. But now there is a real shift in the air, right? Like, I know so many different people who sometimes they can be on quite funny solutions, but often they're also really driven about how they look after themselves and really driving themselves to be high performers, right?
But it's interesting because unfortunately, a lot of people have suffered through the COVID in many different ways, and it's really sad. But it almost means what's true in life is that with enough tension, then changes happen. And a crisis is no different than an opportunity. And necessity is the mother of invention. And so this is a huge shock on the world, which has told us you got to wake up. And I think a lot of people are truly waking up on many different levels. And it starts off with a reflection. So part of it has to do with the people that are able to do this is really reflect on, okay, what is that quality of life? Is it really that important to be part of this rat race? Is that really what life is really all about? Or is there much more to that? And you talk to anybody who's had some major challenges in life, and they use that as a milestone, as the best thing that ever happened to them. And so if we can start looking at it from that perspective and start making better choices, not just for ourselves, but for everyone, I think we're diverting this crashing against the wall that was supposed to happen in the next 5 to 10 years because we weren't woken up.
And I actually do think, in many ways, like, one of the reasons why we started this series, it was very much like, it was literally started when lockdown was about to happen. And it was like, the digital acceleration is coming. People are going to need to start figuring out what they do in respect to healthcare. I mean, that has just transformed overnight, where the sort of people beginning thinking about like how you can train a virus is like it's the only way that this terrible disease that's sort of made death rates rise across the world, just stopping that so it's safe to travel and do all these things. But then now actually the impact of it has been wonderful in some ways, right? Because you've got the UK no longer is burning coal. I mean, that will never, hopefully never happen again, right? And obviously other countries like China and the like are still massively burning coal, but you've got sort of traffic down, people adopting conversations online. I think it's phenomenal to me how quickly a lot of the stuff that I spend my time thinking about, sort of the rise of AI, how automation happens, how society changes, it just happened overnight.
Yep.
And workforces were suddenly, well, of course we can work from home and do it all out, because if not, they didn't have a business. And but before that, there was like, get people to travel an hour and 20 minutes in the 21st century to do some in-person meetings. And I think we'll look back on like pre-COVID era as slightly crazy.
No, absolutely. And you know, my perspective was also this one is that without this, I think we were just going down a rabbit hole with technology and internet, and it caused us to was causing. Well, let me put it this way: I think so many people have been so disconnected, even though we can be so much more connected. But because of this, it's forcing us to actually be more connected with the ability to connect the connections that we have today. Otherwise, I think it would have been lost. I mean, unfortunately, you see what happens in today's world is how many people are so disconnected, are addicted to social media, and have major issues with depression and other mental health issues. And I think that's really stopped that. And I think it stopped that because now everybody's aware of we need to use the technology we have in the best possible way so that it really could serve us in the best possible way versus be detrimental to our own well-being.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And I think, yeah, so many different people sort of and maybe it is a problem, but I count myself as one of them, is and you sort of whisper it slightly quietly, going like, sort of, what's like, I'm great because of COVID, and you sort of, it takes a while to process, and it's not something, because it's been very, very serious,
Right.
many families and many people's lives. But at the same time, like, me not traveling anywhere for a 3-month period was something that I could never fully imagine, just because sort of you'd be sort of speaking at a conference or doing a business meeting overseas or going on a break. And yeah, I think it's helped a lot of us become less materialistic as well, right?
Exactly. No, absolutely. You're 100% right.
Um, so in terms of sort of the audience, we're happy to sort of take questions, or I'm also sort of going to very much enjoy quizzing Bart for as much as I like. But there's a chat and a Q&A box, so we can tackle any themes that you.
You know, I'm happy also for the listeners to share a little bit about how cell therapy works, if you want me to spend a little bit of time on that.
Yeah, I'd love to dive further into that.
So to keep it very, straightforward, I guess, is that, as I mentioned earlier, there's 70 trillion cells in the body. And there's a very small number of stem cells distributed throughout the body, typically in very small capillaries or small blood vessels. And what happens is that these little stem cells, they replicate into more stem cells. And then but they're in a little kind of what's called a niche. And in that niche, they're kind of, protected, if you will. But as soon as they get out of that niche, they come into a different environment around that cell. Now they start differentiating into a specific cell. Let's say it's cartilage, let's say it's fat, or other types of cells or connective tissue cells that we get. And so the whole concept of regenerative medicine is focused on how is it that we take advantage of those stem cells to make other cells and to do all the corrective processes to restore form and function. And so what we've been doing for quite some time is we perform liposuction, take out fat. There's a huge number of cells in the fat tissue. We separate the cells from the fat tissue with enzymes and centrifuges and all that kind of stuff. And then we would give it back to patients. And I've treated patients with orthopedic injuries. I've treated patients with Parkinson's, MS, eye disorders, even cardiac disease. We were injecting into the cardiac muscle. And so nowadays, but I started this 10 years ago, but now the industry has really caught up, which is awesome, because now we don't have to, now we don't require surgery to get those cells. Now we can get cells from umbilical cord tissue, which is wonderful because it's non-controversial. It's a great source of cells. It's totally safe, and it falls under the purview of regular blood transfusions and organ transplants. So it's very safe in that respect. And what happens, Toby, is that we get a large number of cells, and we're stepping away from the term stem cells. We're calling it MSC cells, which are mesenchymal stromal cells, because what happens is that when we get enough of those cells and other products, we deliver to the patient. What we're delivering basically is a lot of signals. So a lot of messengers of growth factors, proteins called chemokines or cytokines, that when they get delivered to the tissues, they then stimulate the cells within the tissues to do what they need to do. And it's really that straightforward. And so it's a very straightforward process. People ask me, well, isn't there an issue with an immune response, when you give somebody else's cells? These cells that we get from the umbilical cord, they're called immunoprivileged, which means they lack certain surface antigens that would appear to be foreign when given to somebody else. And so it has widespread use throughout the world with tremendous results. I think anybody who's ever considering any kind of therapy is really to do their homework, because unfortunately there's too many bad actors out there, or their sources of cells are from animals at times, which in of itself doesn't have to be a problem, but you really want to make sure that you want to get human cells, and you want to get it from a company that is really beyond reproach. And unfortunately, there are not that many out there. Unfortunately, the one that I work with, it really is tremendous integrity, tremendous products. And so I feel really comfortable being able to use that. But it's attacking the root cause of all current, medical problems. And, as a surgeon myself, my practice has always been, what can we do without surgery? Let's investigate other things before surgery. Because surgery is a very dramatic approach. It really changes everything. But that's it. That's how stem cells work in a nutshell.
It's amazing. And yeah, I think it must be super exciting to be at the forefront of such an innovative field. But it is kind of intriguing. And so when you're getting the human cells as well, are you getting it from a human donor? How
Yes.
does that work? So
Yeah, the way it works, the proper way that it works, it's healthy volunteers that have gone through extensive screening. all sorts of things, medical history, social history, and then all the lab tests for infectious disease and everything else. And then they're not compensated. They're just a normal, they're for scheduled C-sections. And everything is done by professionals and the baby's safe. And then this product, which would normally be thrown away, right, can now be utilized to save people's lives.
So during the stem cells are generally gathered during a C-section, you're saying? So
That is correct.
very interesting. So typically from a mother and during the process, and the stem cells would, is that right?
Say that again.
The stem cells are from the mother, or they're from the baby?
So the stem cells are from the umbilical cord.
Umbilical cord.
Right.
Never
So based, yeah. So pretty much the stromal cells,
yeah.
they're generated in that tissue. So it's not like the baby is giving their cells off. But the umbilical cord is generated from the original stem cells that came from the baby. You know, that's the term that we use is blastocyst, and then it becomes a fetus. And all that is generated from the original fertilized egg. So it's not from the mom, because the mom would have the wouldn't have the immunoprivileged cells because they would have all the antigens. So yes, in essence, this is derived from the original egg that was fertilized.
I mean, it's amazing, isn't it? The sort of I guess the power of the natural process and what you can harness. Fascinating. So, and how did people sort of discover this innovation? What was sort of behind, like, were people just experimenting? Like,
right. I'm glad you asked, because that's a great question. So we're going to go on a very brief historical journey. This actually goes all the way back to the Greeks, and Aristotle, in his works of natural history, recognized the concept of regenerative medicine as he looked at salamanders and deer and how they could replicate their limbs and their antlers, and recognized that it basically gave the concept of epigenetics at that time, how the organisms came from undifferentiated cells. And so fast forward to the 8th century, you have considered the first Western poet, Hesiod, in his Theogony, talking about the Titan Prometheus, who gave a gift to mankind with fire, but stole it from Zeus, and Zeus then punished him. And so he punished him by chaining him to the Carpathian Mountains. And for 30,000 years, Prometheus was visited by Ethon, the eagle, every single day, who picked at his liver. And then through the nights, that liver would regenerate. So the Greeks already understood the whole concept of regenerative medicine, because hepar, which is the term for liver, actually translates into replacing itself, replacing tissue itself. And so it starts with their concept then about regenerative medicine. So fast forward, many different cultures have experimented with all sorts of different things, but it wasn't really till the last century, no, the 19th century, end of the 19th century, when people discovered that bone marrow cells could actually help with wound healing. And then later on in the 1980s, finally, the word stem cell was coined by Arnold Kaplan, but it was actually in the 70s that the first bone marrow transplant was done. And so, in essence, regenerative medicine has happened over the last 50 years, starting off with bone marrow transplant and skin grafting, that kind of thing. But more recently, since 2009, more formalized clinical trials approved here in the United States to study stem cells. And now, worldwide, there's a lot of clinical evidence or clinical studies out there. It's still very much in the infancy. There's still a paucity of information. The biggest problem is that there isn't enough transparency between investigators. So we really don't know what one investigator is doing and what the other one isn't. It's hard to compare things, but also how people are harvesting the cells is very, very different. And so it's very challenging for anyone to say, look, this is how it works, and this is why it works, and to do comparative analysis. The one thing we do know, it works.
And presumably that's because they're looking to have a proprietary method, and the problem is you can't patent the human body fully, right? Like,
that might be, I don't know.
yeah.
I do know that scientists sometimes have big egos, so they want to get, and I experienced that too, because I started with stem cell surgeries about 10 years ago when that technology was first available in the United States. But interesting enough, academia was telling us, well, you can't do this, and you can't do that. I was one of the first 25 surgeons to start it. But a lot of people want to just want to keep that reputation, for themselves. And that's not right. What's right is that there are a lot of sick people out there, and if we have the ability to help them, like we've seen with COVID, we deserve to do that. But we have to do it in a very intelligent way. And the one thing that I share with everyone and my own patients is that I'm not just going to focus on regenerative cell therapy. I'm going to focus on your lifestyle and all the other aspects that in of themselves may be enough. And then only then incorporate regenerative medicine if necessary, or just do it in tandem. But there's no sense spending any penny, if you will, on a system if you're not going to make the commitment to change your lifestyle.
Okay, yeah, fantastic. So sounds a very sound approach, and yeah, so it's and a great sort of the 10 years that you've been doing this. It must have been a great experience, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So in terms of in terms of sort of where you think what's next in regenerative medicine from your point of view.
So I think the next step that I see here in the U.S. and worldwide is that the regulatory bodies get a good handle on the safety and the efficacy of this, to give us good guidelines so that doctors have free access to this process. In the United States, it's regulated. You just can't promote it, you can't advertise it, and that's fair because there's still not enough information out there. And I think, unfortunately, there's too many people that aren't quite doing the right thing. And this is all over the world. I mean, this is not only in the U.S., but it's everywhere else. So number one, tighter regulations, better understanding, so that we can safely apply this, but also make it affordable. you know, that's the key thing. My pricing, for example, is clearly a lot less than some people, only because it's disgraceful to take advantage of those that can afford it, and so many people that just can't. It's just ridiculous to charge that amount of money. So that's going to shift as well. I think what's going to happen is that it's going to start off with many critical conditions that aren't, resolved with any standard medical treatments. I think we'll see a lot of that first going on. As that proof of concept is in place, then it's going to extend, much wider. I think where it's going to get very exciting more than anything else is because when you look at regenerative medicine, it's really about tissue engineering and molecular biology, using biomaterials and different molecules and scaffolds to restore that form and function. And so that's part of it. So potentially recreating organs on different scaffolds. I think that might be an interesting concept. Potentially, people who are on dialysis, for example, which is what's needed for when the kidney function isn't working anymore, definitely replacing those cells. And so there's going to be a shift in many companies delivering those kinds of services. But if we can offer, better health and quality of health to people who don't need those, then that's going to be a win for them. I think the cost of medicine in general will probably, plummet, which is a good thing. It's a tough this conversation to talk about, why it's so expensive, and I'm not going to go there, but it's outrageous. And I think if we just resort to what I call first principles, use the natural potential of the body to fix itself, I think we're going to have some tremendous changes. But
Yeah.
the other part, what I mentioned, is this, is that if we can start designing new therapeutics that can be tested on the platform of regenerative cells that potentially regenerative cells can't fix, but we can test them based on that, I think is phenomenal. And as I mentioned, if we can replace those pancreatic cells in somebody's arm, for example, put those cells back in there that make insulin, and the person doesn't need insulin anymore. Just think, I mean, all the diabetics, I mean, it's essentially a time bomb. A lot of parts of the body just stop functioning after a period of time, regardless of how well they've regulated with insulin. It's just not possible to do it effectively if you don't have enough cells in your body. So I see a lot of that happening as well. I think, and then gene therapy, understanding how that works and how we can modify the genes, and not so much modify the genes, I would say, but really harness the potential of epigenetics. And just to put that in perspective, if your listeners aren't aware of it, is simply this, is that we basically have 22,000 or 21,000 genes. But just those number of genes doesn't help us understand the difference between humans and the Anopheles fly, because the similarity genes is very high. I think somewhere 97%. Don't quote me on that one. But the real difference, the real distinction is that there's also 2 million switches. So depending on whatever combination of switches are on or off, that's going to cause the gene expression. Those switches get turned on and off based on the environment around the gene. So you change your environment, you also then change the expression of the genes. And so that's huge. And understanding that and how we can modify disease. And I'm going to give you one classic example. Most people think, Alzheimer's is terminal. Most people think that it's not curable. And most people realize it's a huge burden on society. But guess what? It's completely reversible if you catch it in time. And there are great scientists out there that have discovered that there's essentially 36 different, what I call, entry points. You tackle each of those 36 entry points, you can reverse cognitive decline. And what that means is you're changing the environment, you're changing the gene expression of cells so that you don't go down this terrible, tunnel of Alzheimer's.
Fantastic. And which of these conditions do you think we're sort of furthest along the road to really tackling? Is sort of, where are the next victories coming? So Alzheimer's, diabetes, which ones are you most?
I think, the big one, I think, is going to be cancer. And it's very early on in that. I can quote several studies on adenocarcinoma of the lung and the breast that in the laboratory have shown, elimination of those conditions. And so my guess is that that's going to be one of the big ones, coming up. I mean, we've been looking for cures for cancer for quite a long time, but we've been focused on drugs and potentially some sort of gene therapy. I think the answer is going to be here because, these cancer cells are considered abnormal. They're just out of control, and the system that we have can't control them anymore. And simplistically, and this is my perception of it, same thing with allergies and everything else. With the advanced, world that we live in compared to 200 years ago, our bodies are bombarded with all sorts of toxins and all sorts of challenges. And so our immune system is just simply overwhelmed. And because of that, we can't take care of these kinds of things. And with regenerative medicine, I think that's going to be one of the biggest opportunities that will be available.
And I'm not sure if we have a question from the audience, but I may allow Erin, who actually helped us put this webinar together, to talk, if that's her intention. So Erin, you're now able to talk if you want to.
Oh, cool. So I'm interested to know about regenerative medicine and allergies because I deal with that a lot, and some of my other friends do too. Is it possible to relieve allergies with the regenerative medicine?
So basically what an allergy is, it's an immune response going out of control. And so one of the things that regenerative medicine does, it modulates the immune response. Now, I don't know of any specific clinical studies that are looking at allergies and that kind of stuff, but I will share a great author by the name of John E. Sarno, who looks at his book called The Divided Mind. And he looks at, what our mind is, how our mind is participating in all the different things that are happening in the body. Again, it's the study of epigenetics. There's only 3 things that affect gene expression. It's the external toxins, it's the internal toxins, and our thoughts. So there is that possibility that, basically, our bodies are just simply overwhelmed on so many different levels. And, change your thoughts, change your life. But if you want the fast track, well, maybe regenerative medicine can help, because it has to do with inflammation as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
No, it sounds so fascinating. And as a bad sufferer of many allergies, I'm excited for that kind of thing to come off.
Well, I'll be honest with you. I'm not your typical surgeon or typical doctor. I've been very fortunate. I grew up in 5 different countries and, studied at some of the best institutions in Europe and in the US. And, I've totally departed from traditional medicine. And I believe that the mind is a major component, or the biggest component, in all medical conditions. Not that you're crazy, not that you're nuts, none of that. But just think of this way. If you're stressed and you're breathing less, your tissue oxygenation is dropped. And that's why you have all these oxygen bars out there, right? But that's kind of a Band-Aid on the issue. But when you drop your oxygen in your tissues, that creates a cascade of all sorts of problems, of inflammation, of immune response, all these things, such that then you have a condition. Maybe it's an allergy. But I'm not going to go deeper on this, but if you go even deeper and look at some of the work that Freud has done, sometimes our symptoms that we have are just a manifestation of some unconscious conflicts. And so that's why I think COVID is great, because it's allowing us to really get back to our roots, getting to our basics, reflecting about life, finding more peace and harmony. But the truth is, all these things will help you. Your head, your lifestyle, your supplements, get the right kind of biomarkers to understand where your imbalances are. And when you really get stuck, as a last resort, do your cell therapy.
And we touched on genetics and epigenetics and sort of thinking really futuristically. There was obviously quite a lot of buzz in the UK and controversy as well when Dolly the sheep sort of was cloned, and sort of where do you see the science going in that area? Because obviously, especially in the US, is a very controversial area, but the sort of at the same time it's very sort of out there futurism. What do you see happening?
Right.
Yeah.
So fortunately, the cells that we use can't make animals or can't make organisms. It's not possible. So they are embryonic cells, but they don't have they're not what's called totipotent, which means they can create an organism, but also all the other tissues to help create that organism, which is the placenta and everything else. So what happens is that all the cells that we use there are cells that are going to die off anyhow. They can't create an organism. They can't create a baby. So there's no controversy with that. But it's essential in our ability to understand disease and how to treat it. So there's a lot of confusion in regards to that. You know, the studies on that level of genetics or embryology, that is considered illegal, as best as I know. But the work that we do with cells is not. For example, if I were to take a stem cell out of your fat tissue, it can only create 5 or 6 different types of cells. So there's no way that this would ever cause any kind of ethical issues at all.
Okay, fantastic, fantastic. So, well, I think this has been just a fascinating, wide-ranging discussion, thank you very much for that. So.
No, thank you very much, and for this opportunity. And I just want to remind all the listeners. I mean, what you do yourself to optimize your health with sleep, nutrition, movement, inner balance. I mean, that's the foundation of everything. And if you want to supercharge it even more quickly, then that's where cell therapy comes into play.
Fantastic. And a great final lesson and closing thought. So thank you, Bart.
Thank you.
Very good.
Cheers.